Hi guys, I hope you're all having an amazing, relaxing or exciting bank holiday weekend. My name's Georgia and I am a conversation starter at the Yard, and something really exciting is happening today because I am going to be reading you guys a book. Yeah, that's right. All you have to do is sit there, get a cup of tea, get a coffee, maybe get like a cheeky gin and tonic or something, and you can just sit back and listen to me read a story. So the book that we've chosen is called The Six of Crows, and it is part of the Grisha verse. And I'm not sure if you guys have Netflix, but they've recently created a TV series called Shadow and Bone, which is by the same person who wrote this book. So it's all part of that same universe. So this is really exciting because it will give us more of an insight into the characters. It'll introduce the story for many people, I'm sure. And yeah, I'm really excited about this because it is exactly my cup of tea. It's a bit Game of Thrones. It's a little bit fantastical. It's a little bit Lord of the Rings. There's a little bit in that. So if you like stories like that, or even if you don't like stories like that, you might love this. So we're going to be reading a couple of parts today. So here we go. I'm very excited. Okay. Just had two problems, the moon and his moustache. He was supposed to be making his rounds at the Hode house, but for the last 15 minutes he'd been hovering around the southeast wall of the gardens, trying to think of something clever and romantic to say to Anya. If only Anya's eyes were blue like the sea or green like an emerald. Instead, her eyes were brown, lovely, dreamy, melted chocolate brown, rabbit fur brown. Just tell her she's got skin like moonlight, his friend Peter said. Girls love that. A perfect solution, but the Ketterdam weather was not cooperating. There'd been no breeze off the harbour that day, and the grey milk fog had reefed the city's canals and crooked alleys in damp. Even here, among the mansion of the Geldstraat, the air hung thick with the smell of fish and bilge water, and smoke from the refineries on the city's outer islands had smeared the night sky in a briny haze. The full moon looked less like a jewel than a yellowy blister in need of lancing. Maybe he could compliment Anya's laugh, except he'd never heard her laugh. He wasn't very good with jokes. Just glanced at his reflection in one of the glass panels set into the double doors that led from the house to the side garden. His mother was right. Even in his new uniform, he still looked like a baby. Gently, he brushed his finger along his upper lip. If only his moustache would come in. It definitely felt thicker than yesterday. He'd been a guard in the Stad Watch less than 6 weeks, and it wasn't nearly as exciting as he'd hoped. He thought he'd be running down thieves in the Barrel or patrolling the harbours, getting first look at cargo coming in on the docks. But ever since the assassination of that ambassador at the town hall, the Merchant Council had been grumbling about security. So where was he? Stuck walking in circles at some lucky Murcher's house. Not just any Murcher, though. Councilman Hode was about as high-placed in Ketterdam government as a man could be. The kind of man who could make a career. Just adjusted the set of his coat and rifle, then patted the weighted baton on his hip. Maybe Hode would take a liking to him. Sharp-eyed and quick with the cudgel, Hode would say, that fellow deserves a promotion. Sergeant Just Van Poel, he whispered, savouring the sound of the words. Captain Just Van Poel. Stop gawking at yourself. Just whirled, his cheeks going hot, as Henk and Rutger strode into the side garden. They were both older, bigger, and broader of shoulder than Just, and they were house guards, private servants of the Councilman Hode. That meant that he wore his pale green livery, carried fancy rifles from Novya Yen, and never let Just forget he was a lowly grunt in the city watch. Petting that bit of fuzz isn't going to make it grow any faster, Rutger said with a loud laugh. Just tried to summon some dignity. I need to finish my rounds. Rutger elbowed Henk. That means he's going to go stick his head in that Grisha workshop to get a look at his girl. Oh, Anya, won't you use your Grisha magic to make my mustache grow? Hank mocked. Just turned on his heels, cheeks burning, and strode down the eastern side of the house. They'd been teasing him ever since he arrived. If it hadn't been for Anya, he probably would have pleaded with his captain for a reassignment. He and Anya only ever exchanged a few words in his rounds, but she was always the best part of his night. And he had to admit, he liked Hode's house too. The few peeks he'd managed through the windows. Hode had one of the grandest mansions on the Geldstraat. Floors set with gleaming squares of black and white stone, shining dark wood walls lit by brown blown glass chandeliers that floated like jellyfish near coffered ceilings. Sometimes just liked to pretend that it was his house and that he was a rich merchant just out for a stroll through his fine garden. Before he rounded the corner, just took a deep breath. Anya, your eyes are brown like tree bark? He'd think of something. He was better off being spontaneous anyway. He was surprised to see the glass-panelled doors to the Grisha workshop open. More than the hand-painted blue tiles in the kitchen or the mantels laden with potted tulips, this workshop was a testimony to Hode's wealth. Grisha indentures didn't come cheap, and Hode had 3 of them. But Yuri wasn't seated at the long work table, and Anya was nowhere to be seen. Only Repvenko was there, sprawled out on a chair in dark blue robes, eyes shut, a book open on his chest. Just hovered in the doorway, then cleared his throat. These doors should be shut and unlocked at night. House is like a furnace, Repvenko drawled without opening his eyes, his Ravkan accent thick and rolling. Tell Hode I stopped sweating, I close doors. Repvenko was a squalor, older than the other Grisha indentures. His hair shot through with silver. There were rumours that he'd fought for the losing side in Ravka's civil war, and he'd fled to Kerch after the fighting. I'd be happy to present your complaints to Councilman Hode, just lied. The house was always overheated, as if Hode were under obligation to burn coal, but just wasn't going to be the one to mention it. Until then, you bring the news of Yuri? Repvenko interrupted, finally opening his heavily hooded eyes. Just glanced uneasily at the bowls of red grapes and heaps of burgundy velvet on the worktop. Yuri had been working on bleeding colour from the fruit into the curtains for Mistress Hode, but he'd fallen badly ill a few days ago and just hadn't seen him since. Dust had begun to gather on the velvet and the grapes were going bad. I haven't heard anything. Of course you hear nothing, too busy strutting around in stupid purple uniform. What's wrong with this uniform? And why did Repvenko even have to be here? He was Hode's personal scholar and often travelled with the merchant's most precious cargoes, guaranteeing favourable winds to bring the ship safely and quickly to harbour. Why couldn't he be away at sea now? I think Yuri might be quarantined. So helpful, Repvenko said with a sneer. You can stop craning your neck like a hopeful goose, he added. Anya's gone. Just felt his face heat again. Where is she? He asked, trying to sound authoritative. She should be in after dark. 1 hour ago, Hode takes her, same as night he came for Yuri. What do you mean he came for Yuri? Yuri fell ill. Hode comes for Yuri, Yuri comes back sick. 2 days later, Yuri vanishes for good. Now Anya. For good? Maybe there was an emergency. If someone needed to be healed, first Yuri, now Anya. I'll be next and no one will notice except poor little Officer Juiced. Go now. If Councilman Hode, Repvenko raised an arm and a gust of air slammed Juiced backwards. Just scrambled to keep his footing, grabbing for the door frame. I said, now. Repvenko etched a circle in the air and the door slammed shut. Just let go just in time to avoid having his fingers smashed and toppled into the side garden. He got to his feet as quickly as he could, wiping muck from his uniform, shame squirming in his belly. One of the glass panes in the door had cracked from the force. Through it, he saw the squalor smirking. That's counting against your indenture, Deuce said, pointing to the ruined pane. He hated how small and petty his voice sounded. Repinko waved his hand and the doors trembled on their hinges. Without meaning to, just took a step back. Go and make your rounds, little watchdog, Repinko called. Well, that went well, snickered Rutger, leaning against the garden wall. How long has he been standing there? Don't you have something better to do than follow me around? Just asked. All guards are to report to the boathouse, even you. Or are you too busy making friends? I was asking him to shut the door. Rutger shook his head. You don't ask, you tell. They're servants, not honoured guests. Just fell into a step beside him, inside still churning with humiliation. The worst part was that Rutger was right. Repinko had no business talking to him that way. What was Just supposed to do? Even if he'd had the courage to get into a fight with the scholar, it would be like brawling with an expensive vase. The Grisha weren't just servants, they were Hode's treasured possessions. What had Repinko meant about Yuri and Anya being taken anyway? Had he been covering for Anya? Grisha indentures were kept to the house for good reason. To walk the streets without protection was to risk getting plucked up by a slaver and never seen again. Maybe she's meeting someone, Just speculated miserably. His thoughts were interrupted by the blaze of light and activity down by the boathouse that faced the canal. Across the water, he could see other fine merchant houses, tall and slender, the tidy gables of their rooftops making a dark silhouette against the night sky, their gardens and boathouses lit by glowing lanterns. A few weeks before, Just had been told that Hode's boathouse would be undergoing improvements and to strike it from his rounds. But when he and Rutger entered, he saw no paint or scaffolding. The gondolas and oars had been pushed up against the walls. The other house guards were there in their sea green livery, and Just recognised as two Stadwatch guards in purple. But most of the interior was taken up by a huge box, a kind of freestanding cell that looked as if it was made from reinforced steel, its seams thick with rivets, a huge window embedded in one of its walls. The glass had a wavy bent, and through it Just could see a girl seated at a table, clutching her red silks tight around her. Behind her, a Stadwatch guard stood at attention. Anya, Just realised with a start. Her brown eyes were wide and frightened, her skin pale. The little boy sitting across from her looked doubly terrified. His hair was sleep tousled and his legs dangled from the chair, kicking nervously at the air. Why all the guards? Asked Just. There had to be more than 10 of them crowded into the boathouse. Councilman Hode was there too, along with another merchant Just didn't know, both of them dressed in matcha black. Just stood up straight when he saw that they were talking to the captain of the Stadwatch. He hoped he'd got all the guard and mud off his uniform. What is this? Rutger shrugged. Who cares? It's a break in the routine. Just looked back through the glass. Anya was staring out at him, her gaze unfocused. The day he'd arrived at Hode House, she'd healed a bruise on his cheek. It had been nothing, the yellow-green remnants of a crack he'd taken to the face during a training exercise, but apparently Hode had caught sight of it and he didn't like his guards looking like thugs. Just had been sent to the Grisha workshop, and Anya had sat him down in a bright square of late winter sunlight. Her cool fingers had passed over his skin, and though the itch had been terrible, bare seconds later it was as if the bruise had never been. When Just thanked her, Anya had smiled and Just was lost. He knew his cause was hopeless. Even if she'd had any interest in him, he could never afford to buy her indenture from Hode, and she would never marry unless Hode decreed it. But it hadn't stopped him from dropping by to say hello or bring her little gifts. She'd liked the map of Kerch best, a whimsical drawing of their island nation, surrounded by mermaids swimming in the true sea, and ships blown along by winds depicted as fat-cheeked men. It was a cheap souvenir the kind tourists bought along the East Stave, but it seemed to please her. Now he risked a hand in greeting. Anya showed no reaction. She can't see, you moron, laughed Rutger. The glass is mirrored on the other side. Just cheeks pinked. How was I to know that? Open your eyes and pay attention for once. First Yuri, now Anya. Why do they need a Grisha healer? Is that boy injured? He looks fine to me. The captain and Hode seemed to reach some kind of agreement. Through the glass, just saw Hode enter the cell and give the boy an encouraging pat. There must have been vents in the cell because he heard Hode say, "Be a brave lad, and there's a few Kruger in it for you." Then he grabbed Anya's chin with a liver-spotted hand. She tensed and just gut tightened. Hode gave Anya's head a little shake. "Do as you're told, and this will be over soon. Yeah?" She gave him a small, tight smile. "Of course, Uncle." Hode whispered a few words to the guard behind Anya, then stepped out. The door shut with a loud clang, and Hode slid a heavy lock into place. Hode and the other merchant took positions almost directly in front of Just and Rutger. The merchant just didn't know, said, "You're sure this is wise? The girl is a corporal, Nick. After what happened to your fabricator, if it was Replinko, I'd be worried. But Anya has a sweet disposition. She's a healer, not prone to aggression. And you've lowered the dose." "Yes, but we're agreed that if we have the same results as the fabricator, the council will compensate me. I can't be asked to bear that expense." When the merchant nodded, Hode signalled to the captain, "Proceed." The same results as the fabricator. Replinko claimed Yuri had vanished. Was that what he meant? "Sergeant," said the captain, "are you ready?" The guard inside the cell replied, "Yes, sir." He drew a knife. Juice swallowed hard. "First test," said the captain. The guard bent forwards and told the boy to roll up his sleeve. The boy obeyed and stuck out his arm, popping the thumb of his other hand into his mouth. Too old for that, thought Just, but the boy must have been very scared. Just had slept with a sock bare until he was nearly 14, a fact his older brothers had mocked him mercilessly for. "This will sting just a bit," said the guard. The boy kept his thumb in his mouth and nodded, eyes round. "This really isn't necessary," said Anya. "Quiet, please," said Hode. The guard gave the boy a pat, then slashed a bright red cut across his forearm. The boy started crying immediately. Anya tried to rise from her chair, but the guard placed a stern hand on her shoulder. "It's all right, Sergeant," said Hode. "Let her heal him." Anya leant forwards, taking the boy's hand gently. "Shh," she said softly. "Let me help." "Will it hurt?" the boy gulped. She smiled. "Not at all. Just a little itch. Try to hold still for me." Just found himself leaning closer. He'd never actually seen Anya heal someone. Anya removed a handkerchief from her sleeve and wiped away the excess blood. Then her fingers brushed carefully over the boy's wound. Just watching in astonishment as the skin slowly seemed to reform and knit together. A few minutes later, the boy grinned and held out his arm. It looked a bit red, but otherwise smooth and unmarked. Was that magic? Anya tapped him on the nose. "Of a sort. The same magic your own body works when given time and a bit of a bandage." The boy looked almost disappointed. Good, good," Hode said impatiently. "Now the parem." Just frowned. He'd never heard that word. The captain signalled to his sergeant. "Second sequence." "Put out your arm," the sergeant said to the boy once again. The boy shook his head. "I don't like that part." "Do it." The boy's lower lip quivered, but he put out his arm. The guard cut him once more. Then he placed a small wax paper envelope on the table in front of Anya. "Swallow the contents of the packet," Hode instructed Anya. "What is it?" she asked, voice trembling. "That isn't your concern." "What is it?" she repeated. "It's not going to kill you. We're going to ask you to perform some simple tasks to judge the drug's effects. The sergeant is there to make sure you do only what you're told and no more. Understood?" Her jaw set, but she nodded. "No one will harm you," said Hode. "But remember, if you hurt the sergeant, you have no way out of that cell. The doors are locked from the outside." "What is that stuff?" whispered Just. "I don't know," Rutger said. "What do you know?" he muttered. "Enough to keep my trap shut." Just scowled. With shaking hands, Anya lifted the little wax envelope and opened the flap. "Go on," said Hode. She tipped her head back and swallowed the powder. For a moment she sat, waiting, lips pressed together. Is it just Gerda? She asked hopefully. Just found himself hoping too. Gerda was nothing to fear, a stimulant everyone in the stud watch chewed to stay awake on late watches. What does it taste like? Hode said. Like Gerda, but sweeter. Anya inhaled sharply. Her hand seized the table, her pupils dilating enough that her eyes looked nearly black. Ah, she said, sighing. It was nearly a purr. The guard tightened his grip on her shoulder. How do you feel? She stared at the mirror and smiled. Her tongue peeped through her white teeth, stained like rust. Just suddenly felt cold. Just as it was with the fabricator, murmured the merchant. Heal the boy, Hode commanded. She waved her hand through the air, the gesture almost dismissive, and the cut on the boy's arm sealed instantly. The blood lifted briefly from his skin in droplets of red and then vanished. His skin looked perfectly smooth, all trace of blood, all redness gone. The boy beamed. That was definitely magic. It feels like magic, Annie said with the same eerie smile. She didn't touch him, marvelled the captain. Anya, said Hode, listen closely. We're going to tell the guard to perform the next test now. Hummed Anya. Sergeant, said Hode, cut off the boy's thumb. The boy howled and started to cry again. He shoved his hands beneath his legs to protect them. I should stop this, Juice thought. I should find a way to protect her, both of them. But what then? He was a nobody, new to the stud watch, new to this house. Besides, he discovered in a burst of shame, I want to keep my job. Anya merely smiled and tilted her head back so she was looking at the sergeant. Shoot the glass. What did she say? Asked the merchant. Sergeant, the captain barked out. Shoot the glass, Anya repeated. The sergeant's face went slack. He cocked his head to one side as if listening to a distant melody, then unslung his rifle and aimed at the observation window. Get down! Someone yelled. Just threw himself to the ground, covering his head as the rapid hammer of gunfire filled his ears and bits of glass rained down on his hands and back. His thoughts were a panicked clamour. His mind tried to deny it, but he knew what he'd just seen. Anya had commanded the sergeant to shoot the glass. She'd made him do it, but that couldn't be. Grisha Corporal Kai specialised in the human body. They could stop your heart, slow your breathing, snap your bones. They couldn't get inside your head. For a moment there was silence. Then Just was on his feet with everyone else, reaching for his rifle. Hode and the captain shouted at the same time, Subdue her! Shoot her! Do you know how much money she's worth? Hode retorted. Someone restrain her. Do not shoot. Anya raised her hands, red sleeves spread wide. Wait, she said. Just panic vanished. He knew he'd been frightened, but his fear was a distant thing. He was filled with expectation. He wasn't sure what was coming or when, only that it would arrive and that it was essential he be ready to meet it. It might be bad or good. He didn't really care. His heart was free of worry and desire. He longed for nothing, wanted for nothing. His mind silent, his breath steady. He only needed to wait. He saw Anya rise and pick up the little boy. He heard her crooning tenderly to him, some Ravkan lullaby. Open the door and come in, Hode, she said. Just heard the words, understood them, forgot them. Hode walked to the door and slid the bolt free. He entered the cell. Do as you're told, and this will be over soon, yeah? Anya murmured with a smile. Her eyes were black and bottomless pools. Her skin was alight, glowing, incandescent. A thought flickered through Juice's mind, beautiful as the moon. Anya shifted the boy's weight in her arms. Don't look, she murmured against his hair. Now, she said to Hode, pick up the knife. So that was the first part in the Six of Crows. Please let me know if you enjoyed it, what you thought of it. if you are looking forward to the next part, and I will see you guys again soon. Bye. Hello everyone, hope you had a really good weekend. I had an amazing weekend. The weather has been brilliant. I had lots of outside time. I went to Russian lakes and just kind of walked around. So yeah, drop in the comments what you did over the weekend, if you did anything good, even if it's just a walk. And yeah, so welcome to story time. My name's Georgia and I am a conversation starter at the Yard, and we are reading Six of Crows, which is a book by Leigh Bardugo, who is a #1 New York Times bestselling author, and she is also the creator of the Shadow and Bone series, which is recently come to Netflix and has been like quite a big success, I think. So if you like this book, definitely check it out. Check out her other books. And yeah, so chapter 2 is called Inej. Kaz Brecker didn't need a reason. Those were the words whispered on the streets of Ketterdam, in the taverns and coffee houses, in the dark and bleeding alleys of the pleasure district known as the Barrel. The boy they called Dirty Hands didn't need a reason any more than he needed permission to break a leg, sever an alliance, or change a man's fortunes with the turn of a card. Of course they were wrong, Inej considered as she crossed the bridge over the black waters of the Björkskanal to the deserted main square that fronted the exchange. Every act of violence was deliberate, and every favour came with enough strings attached to stage a puppet show. Kaz always had his reasons. Inej could just never be sure they were good ones, especially tonight. Inej checked her knives, silently reciting their names, as she always did when she thought there might be trouble. It was a practical habit, but a comfort too. The blades were her companions. She liked knowing they were ready for whatever the night might bring. She saw Kaz and the others gathered near the great stone arch that marked the eastern entrance to the exchange. 3 words were carved into the rock above them: Engent, Vorhent, Almbent. Industry, integrity, prosperity. She kept close to the shuttered shop fronts that lined the square, avoiding the pockets of flickering gaslight cast by the street lamps. As she moved, she inventoried the crew Kaz had brought with him: Dirix, Rotti, Muzzin and Keeg, Anika and Pim, and his chosen seconds for tonight's parlay, Jesper and Big Bolliger. They jostled and bumped each other, laughing, stamping their feet against the cold snap that had surprised the city this week, the last gasp of winter before spring began in earnest. They were all bruisers and brawlers, culled from the younger members of the dregs, the people that Kaz trusted most. Inej noted the glint of knives tucked into their belts, lead pipes, weighted chains, axe handles studded with rusty nails, and here and there the oily gleam of a gun barrel. She slipped silently into their ranks, scanning the shadows near the exchange for signs of the black-tipped spies. 3 ships, Jesper was saying. The Shoe sent them. They were just sitting in the first harbour, cannons out, red flags flying, stuffed to the sails with gold. Big Bolliger gave a low whistle. I would have liked to see that. Would have liked to steal that, replied Jesper. Half the merchant council were there, flapping and squawking, trying to figure out what to do. Don't they want the Shoe paying their debts? Big Bolliger asked. Kaz shook his head, dark hair glinting in the lamplight. He was a collection of hard lines and tailored edges. Sharp jaw, lean build, wool coat snug across his shoulders. Yes and no, he said in his rock salt rasp. It's always good to have a country in debt to you. Makes for friendlier negotiations. Maybe the Shoe are done being friendly, said Jesper. They didn't have to send all that treasure at once. You think they stuck that trade ambassador? Kaz's eyes found Inej unerringly in the crowd. Ketterdam had been buzzing about the assassination of the ambassador for weeks. He had nearly destroyed Kirch-Zemeni relations and sent the merchant council into an uproar. The Zemeni blamed the Kirch. suspected the shoe. Kaz didn't care who was responsible. The murder fascinated him because he couldn't figure out how it had been accomplished. In one of the busiest corridors of the Stad Hall, in full view of more than a dozen government officials, the Zemni trade ambassador had stepped into a washroom. No one else had entered or left, but when his aide knocked on the door a few minutes later, there had been no answer. When they'd broken down the door, they found the ambassador face down on the white tiles, a knife in his back, the tap still running. Kaz had sent Inej to investigate the premises after hours. The washroom had no other entrance, no windows or vents, and even Inej hadn't mastered the art of squeezing herself through the plumbing. Yet the Zemni ambassador was dead. Kaz hated a puzzle he couldn't solve, and he and Inej had concocted 100 theories to account for the murder, none of which satisfied. But they had more pressing problems tonight. She saw him signal to Jesper and Big Bolliger to divest themselves of weapons. Street law dictated that for a parley of this kind, each lieutenant be seconded by 2 of his foot soldiers, and they all be unarmed. Parley. The word felt like a deception, strangely prim and antique. No matter what street law decreed, this night smelled like violence. Go on, give those guns over, Derek said to Jesper. With a great sigh, Jesper removed the gun belts at his hips. She had to admit he looked less himself without them. The Zemni sharpshooter was long-limbed, brown-skinned, constantly in motion. He pressed his lips to the pole handles of his prized revolvers, bestowing each with a mournful kiss. Take good care of my babies, Jesper said as he handed them over to Dirks. If I see a single scratch or nick on those, I'll spell forgive me on your chest in bullet holes. You wouldn't waste the ammo. And he'd be halfway dead through forgive, Big Bolliger said as he dropped a hatchet, a switchblade, and his preferred weapon. A thick chain weighted with a heavy padlock into Rotty's expectant hands. Jesper rolled his eyes. It's about sending a message. What's the point of a dead guy with Forge written on his chest? Compromise, Kaz said. I'm sorry, does the trick and uses fewer bullets. Dirks laughed, but Inej noted that he cradled Jesper's revolvers very gently. What about that? Jesper asked, gesturing to Kaz's walking stick. Kaz's laugh was low and humorless. Who denied poor cripple his cane? If the cripple is you, then any man with sense. Then it's a good thing we're meeting Gills. Kaz drew a watch from his vest pocket. It's almost midnight. Inej turned her gaze to the exchange. It was little more than a rectangular courtyard surrounded by warehouses and shipping offices. But during the day, it was the very heart of Ketterdam, bustling with wealthy merchants buying and selling shares in the trade voyages that passed through the city's ports. Now it was nearly 12 bells, and the exchange was deserted but for the guards who patrolled the perimeter and the rooftop. They'd been bribed to look the other way during tonight's parley. The exchange was one of the few remaining parts of the city that hadn't been divvied up and claimed in the ceaseless skirmishes between Ketterdam's rival gangs. It was supposed to be neutral territory, but it didn't feel neutral to Inej. It felt like the hush of the woods before the snare yanks tight and the rabbits start to scream. It felt like a trap. This is a mistake, she said. Big Bolliger started. He hadn't known she was standing there. Inej heard the name the dregs preferred for her whispered among their ranks. The Wraith. Gills is up to something. Of course he is, said Kaz. His voice had the rough, abraded texture of stone against stone. Inej had always wondered if he'd sounded that way as a little boy, if he'd ever been a little boy. Then why come here tonight? Because this is the way Per Haskell wants it. Old man, old ways, Inej thought but didn't say, and she suspected the other dregs were thinking the same thing. He's going to get us all killed, she said. Jesper stretched his long arms overhead and grinned, his teeth white against his dark skin. He had yet to give up his rifle, and the silhouette of it across his back made him resemble a gawky, long-limbed bird. Statistically, he'll probably only get some of us killed. It's not something to joke about, she replied. The look Kaz cast her was amused. She knew how she sounded, stern, fussy, like an old crone making dire pronouncements from her porch. She didn't like it, but she also knew she was right. Besides, old women must know something, or they wouldn't live to gather wrinkles or yell from their front steps. Jasper isn't making a joke, Inej, said Kaz. He's figuring the odds. Big Bollinger cracked his huge knuckles. Well, I've got lager and a skillet of eggs waiting for me at the Cooper room, so I can't be the one to die tonight. Care to place a wager? Jasper asked. I'm not going to bet on my own death. Kaz flicked his hat onto his head and ran his gloved fingers along the brim in a quick salute. Why not, Bollinger? We do it every day. He was right. Inej's debt to Pascal meant she gambled her life every time she took on a new job or assignment, every time she left her room at the Slat. Tonight was no different. Kaz struck his walking stick against the cobblestones as the bells from the Church of Barter began to chime. The group fell silent. The time for talk was done. Gills isn't smart, but he's bright enough to be trouble, said Kaz. No matter what you hear, you don't join the fray unless I give the command. Stay sharp. Then he gave Inej a brief nod and stay hidden. No mourners, Jasper said as he tossed his rifle to Rotty. No funerals, the rest of the dregs murmured in reply. Among them, it passed for good luck. Before Inej could melt into the shadows, Kaz tapped her arm with his crow's head cane. Keep a watch on the rooftop guards. Gills might have them in his pocket. Then Inej began, but Kaz was already gone. Inej threw up her hands in frustration. She had 100 questions, but as usual, Kaz was keeping a stranglehold on answers. She jogged towards the canal-facing wall of the exchange. Only the lieutenants and their seconds were allowed to enter during the parley. But just in case the black tips got any ideas, the other dregs would be waiting outside the eastern arch with weapons at the ready. She knew Gills would have his crew of heavily armoured black tips gathered at the western entrance. Inej would find her own way in. The rules of fair play among the gangs were from Pascal's time. Besides, she was the Wraith. The only law that applied to her was gravity, and some days she defied that too. The lower level of the exchange was dedicated to the windowless warehouses, so Inej located a drain pipe to shimmy up. Something made her hesitate before she wrapped her hand around it. She drew a bone light from her pocket and gave it a shake, casting a pale green glow over the pipe. It was slick with oil. She followed the wall, seeking another option, and found a stone cornice bearing a statue of Kirch's 3 flying fishes within reach. She stood on her toes and tentatively felt along the top of the cornice. It had been covered in ground glass. I am expected, she thought with a grim pleasure. She joined up with the dregs less than 2 years ago, just days after her 15th birthday. It had been a matter of survival, but it gratified her to know that in such a short time she'd become someone to take precautions against. Though, if the black tips thought tricks like this would keep the Wraith from her goal, they were sadly mistaken. She drew 2 climbing spikes from the pockets of her quilted vest and wedged one then the other between the bricks of the wall as she hoisted herself higher, her questing feet finding the smallest holes and ridges in the stone. As a child learning the high wire, she'd gone barefoot, but the streets of Showdown were too cold and wet for that. After a few bad spills, she'd paid a Grisha fabricator working in secret out of a gin shop in the Windstraat to make her a pair of leather slippers with nubbly rubber soles. They were perfectly fitted to her feet and gripped any surface with surety. On the second story of the exchange, she hoisted herself onto a window ledge just wide enough to perch on. Kaz had done his best to teach her, but she didn't quite have his way with breaking and entering, and it took her a few tries to finesse the lock. Finally, she heard a satisfying click, and the window swung open on a deserted office, its walls covered in maps marked with trade routes, and chalkboards listing share prices and the names of ships. She ducked inside, refastened the latch, and picked her way past the empty desks with their neat stacks of orders and tallies. She crossed to a slender set of doors and stepped onto a balcony that overlooked the central courtyard of the exchange. Each of the shipping offices had one. From here, callers announced new voyages and arrivals of inventory, or hung the black flag that indicated that a ship had been lost at sea with all of its cargo. The floor of the exchange would erupt into a flurry of trades. Runners would spread the word throughout the city, and the price of goods, futures, and shares in outgoing voyages would rise or fall. But tonight, all was silent. A wind came in off the harbour, bringing the smell of the sea, ruffling the stray hairs that had escaped the braided coil at the nape of Inej's neck. Down in the square, she saw the sway of lamplight and heard the thump of Kaz's cane on the stones as he and his seconds made their way across the square. On the opposite side, she glimpsed another set of lanterns heading towards them. The black tips had arrived. Inej raised her hood. She pulled herself onto the railing and leaped soundlessly to the neighbouring balcony, then the next, tracking Kaz and the others around the square, staying as close as she could. His dark coat rippled in the salt breeze, his limp more pronounced tonight, as it always was when the weather turned cold. She could hear Jesper keeping up a lively stream of conversation, and Big Bolger's low, rumbling chuckle. As she drew nearer to the other side of the square, Inej saw that Gilles had chosen to bring Elzinga and Uman, exactly as she had predicted. Inej knew the strengths and weaknesses of every member of the Black Tips, not to mention Harley's Pointers, the Liddles, the Razor Girls, the Dime Lions, and every other gang working the streets of Kestam. It was her job to know that Gilles trusted Elzinga because they had come up through the ranks of the Black Tips together, and because Elzinga was built like a stack of boulders, nearly 7 feet tall, dense with muscle, his wide, mashed-in face jammed low on a neck, thick as a pylon. She was suddenly glad Big Bolger was with Kaz. That Kaz had chosen Jesper to be one of his seconds was no surprise. Twitchy as Jesper was, with or without his revolvers, he was at his best in a fight, and she knew he'd do anything for Kaz. She'd been less sure when Kaz had insisted on Big Bolger as well. Big Bol was a bouncer at the Crow Club, perfectly suited to tossing out drunks and wasters, but too heavy on his feet to be much use when it came to a real tussle. Still, at least he was tall enough to look Elzinga in the eye. Inej didn't want to think too much on Gil's other second. Uman made her nervous. He wasn't as physically intimidating as Elzinga. In fact, Uman was made like a scarecrow, not scrawny, but as if beneath his clothes his body had been put together at wrong angles. Word was, he'd once crushed a man's skull with his bare hands, wiped his palms clean on his shirt front, and kept right on drinking. Inej tried to quiet the unease rolling around her, and listened as Gilles and Kaz made the small talk in the square, while their seconds patted each of them down to make sure no one was carrying. "Naughty," Jesper said as he moved the tiny knife from Elzinga's sleeve and tossed it across the square. "Clear," declared Big Bolger as he finished patting down Gilles and moved on to Uman. Kaz and Gilles discussed the weather, the suspicion that the Cooper Run was serving watered-down drinks now that the rent had been raised, dancing around the real reason they'd come here tonight. In theory, they would chat, make their apologies, agree to respect the boundaries of the Fifth Harbour, then head out to find a drink together. At least that's what Per Haskell had insisted. But what does Per Haskell know? Inej thought, as she looked for the guards patrolling the roof above, trying to pick out their shapes in the dark. Haskell ran the dregs, but these days he preferred to sit in the warmth of his room, drinking lukewarm lager, building model ships, and telling long stories of his exploits to anyone who would listen. He seemed to think territory wars could be settled as they once had been, with a short scuffle and a friendly handshake. But every one of Inej's senses told her that this was not how this was going to play out. Her father would have said the shadows were about their own business tonight. Something bad was going to happen here. Kaz stood with both gloved hands rested on the carved crow's head of his cane. He looked totally at ease, his narrow face obscured by the brim of his hat. Most gang members in the Barrel loved flash, gaudy waistcoats, watch fobs studded with false gems, trousers in every print and pattern imaginable. Kaz was the exception, the picture of restraint, his dark vest and trousers simply cut and tailored along severe lines. At first, she'd thought it was a matter of taste, but she'd come to understand that it was a joke he played on the upstanding merchants. He enjoyed looking like one of them. "I'm a businessman," he told her. "No more, no less." "You're a thief, Kaz." "Isn't that what I just said?" Now he looked like some kind of a priest come to preach to a group of circus performers. A young priest, she thought, with another pang of unease. Kaz had called Giles old and washed up, but he certainly didn't seem that way tonight. The black-tipped lieutenant might have wrinkles creasing the corners of his eyes and burgeoning jowls beneath his sideburns, but he looked confident, experienced. Next to him, Kaz looked, well, 17. "Let's be fair, Yar. All we want is a bit more scrub," Giles said, tapping the mirrored buttons of his lime green waistcoat. "It's not fair for you to cull every spend-happy tourist stepping off a pleasure boat at Fifth Harbour." "Fifth Harbour is ours, Giles," Kaz replied. "The dregs get first crack at the pigeons who come looking for a little fun." Giles shook his head. "You're a young one, Brecker," he said with an indulgent laugh. "Maybe you don't understand how these things work. The harbours belong to the city, and we have as much right to them as anyone. We've all got a living to make." Technically, that was true, but Fifth Harbour had been useless and all but abandoned by the city when Kaz had taken it over. He'd had it dredged, then built out the docks and the quay, and he'd had to mortgage the Crow Club to do it. Per Haskell had railed at him and called him a fool for the expense, but eventually he'd relented. According to Kaz, the old man's exact words had been, "Take all that rope and hang yourself." But the endeavour had paid for itself in less than a year. Now, Fifth Harbour offered berths to merchant ships, as well as boats from all over the world carrying tourists and soldiers eager to see the sights and sample the pleasures of Ketterdam. The dregs got first try at all of them, steering them and their wallets into brothels, taverns and gambling dens owned by the gang. Fifth Harbour made the old man very rich and cemented the dregs as real players on the Barrel in a way that not even the success of the Crow Club had. But with all the profit came unwanted attention. Giles and the Black Tips had been making trouble for the dregs all year, encroaching on Fifth Harbour, picking off pigeons that weren't rightfully theirs. "Fifth Harbour is ours," Kaz repeated. "It isn't up for negotiation. You're cutting into our traffic from the docks, and you intercepted a shipment of Jerda that should have been docked 2 nights ago." "Don't know what you're talking about." "I know it comes easy, Giles, but try not to play dumb with me." Giles took a step forwards. Jesper and Big Bollinger tensed. "Quit flexing, boy," Giles said. "We all know the old man doesn't have the stomach for a real brawl." Kaz's laugh was dry as the rustle of dead leaves. "But I'm the one at your table, Giles, and I'm not here for a taste. You want your war? I'll make sure you eat your fill." "And what if you're not around, Brecker? Everyone knows that you're the spine of Haskell's operation. Snap it, and the dregs collapse." Jesper snorted. "Stomach, spine. What's next, spleen?" "Shut it," Ooman snarled. The rules of parley dictated that only the lieutenants could speak once negotiations had begun. Jesper mouthed sorry and elaborately pantomimed, locking his lips shut. "I'm fairly sure you're threatening me, Giles," Kaz said, "but I want to make certain before I decide what I'm going to do about it." "Sure of yourself, aren't you, Becca?" "Myself and nothing else." Giles burst out laughing and elbowed Ooman. "Listen to this cocky little piece of crap. Brecker, you don't even own these streets. Kids like you are fleas. A new crop of you turns up every few years to annoy your betters until a big dog decides to scratch. And let me tell you, I'm about tired of the itch." He crossed his arms, pleasure rolling off of him in smug waves. "What if I told you there are 2 guards with city-issue rifles pointing at you and your boys right now?" Inej's stomach dropped. Was that what Kaz had meant when he said that Gills might have guards in his pocket? Kaz glanced up at the roof. Hiring city guards to do your killing? I'd say that's an expensive proposition for a gang like the Black Tips. I'm not sure I believe your coffers could support it. Inej climbed onto the railing and launched herself from the safety of the balcony, heading for the roof. If they survived the night, she was going to kill Kaz. There were always 2 guards from the Stad Watch posted on the roof of the exchange. A free Kruger from the Dregs and the Black Tips had ensured that they wouldn't interfere with the parlay, a common enough transaction, but Gills was implying something very different. Had he managed to bribe the city guards to play sniper for him? If so, the Dregs' odds of surviving the night had dwindled to a knife's point. Like most of the buildings in Ketterdam, the exchange had a sharply gabled roof to keep off heavy rain, so the guards patrolled the rooftop via a narrow walkway that overlooked the courtyard. Inej ignored it. It was easier going, but it would leave her too exposed. Instead, she scaled halfway up the slick roof tiles and started crawling. Her body tilted at a precarious angle, moving like a spider as she kept one eye on the guard's walkway and one ear on the conversation below. Maybe Gills was bluffing, or maybe the 2 guards were hunched over the railing right now with Kaz or Jesper or Big Bolliger in their sights. Took some doing, Gills admitted. We're a small operation right now and the city guards don't come cheap. We'll be worth it for the prize. That being me, that being you. I'm flattered. The Dregs won't last a week without you. I'd give them a month on sheer momentum. The thought rattled noisily in Inej's head. If Kaz was gone, would I stay? Or would I skip out on my debt? Take my chances with per her scales and forces? If she didn't move faster, she may well find out. Smug little slum rat, Gills laughed. I can't wait to wipe that look off your face. So do it, Kaz said. Inej risked a look down. His voice had changed, all humour gone. Should I have them put a bullet in your good leg, Brecker? Where are the guards? Inej thought, picking up her pace. She raced across the steep pitch of the gable. The exchange stretched nearly half the length of a city block. There was too much territory to cover. Stop talking, Gills. Tell them to shoot. Kaz, said Jesper nervously. Go on, find your balls and give them the order. What game was Kaz playing? Had he expected this? Had he just assumed Inej would find her way to the guards in time? She glanced down again. Gills radiated anticipation. He took a deep breath, puffing out his chest. Inej's steps faltered, and she had to fight not to go sliding straight off the edge of the roof. He's going to do it. I'm going to watch Kaz die. Fire! Gills shouted. A gunshot split the air. Big Bolliger let loose a cry and crumpled to the ground. Damn it, shouted Jesper, dropping to one knee beside Bolliger and pressed his hand to the bullet wound as the big man moaned. You worthless podge, he yelled at Gills. You just violated neutral territory. Nothing to say you didn't shoot first, Gills replied. And who's going to know? None of you are walking out of here. Gills' voice sounded too high. He was trying to maintain his composure, but Inej could hear panic pulsing against his words, the startled wing beat of a frightened bird. Why? Moments before he'd been all bluster. That's when Inej saw Kaz still hadn't moved. You don't look well, Gills. I'm just fine, he said, but he wasn't. He looked pale and shaky. His eyes were darting left and right, as if searching the shadowed walkway of the roof. Are you? Kaz asked conversationally. Things aren't going quite as planned, are they? Kaz, Jesper said. Bolliger's bleeding bad. Good, Kaz said, ignoring him. Kaz, he needs a medic. Kaz spared the wounded man the barest glance. What he needs to do is stop his belly aching and be glad I didn't have Holst take him down with a headshot. Even from above, Inej saw Gills flinch. That's the guard's name, isn't it? Kaz said. Willem Holst and Bert van Daal, the 2 city guards on duty tonight, the ones you emptied the Black Tips coffers to bribe. Gills said nothing. Willem Holst, Kaz said loudly, his voice floating up to the roof. Likes to gamble almost as much as Jasper does, and so your money held a lot of appeal. But Holst has much bigger problems. Let's call them urges. I won't go into detail. A secret's not like a coin. It doesn't keep its value in the spending. You'll just have to trust me when I say this one would even turn your stomach. Isn't that right, Holst? The response was another gunshot. It struck the cobblestones near Gil's feet. Gil's released a shocked bleat and sprang back. This time Inej had a better chance to track the origin of the gunfire. The shot had come from somewhere near the west side of the building. If Holst was there, that meant that the other guard, Bert Van Dahl, would be on the east side. Had Kaz managed to neutralise him too, or was he counting on her? She sped over the gables. Just shoot him, Holst, Gills bellowed, desperation soaring in his voice. Shoot him in the head! Gaz snorted in disgust. Do you really think that secret would die with me? Go on, Holst, he called. Put a bullet in my skull. There will be messages sprinting up to your wife and your watch captain's door before I hit the ground. No shot came. How? Gil said bitterly. How did you even know who would be on duty tonight? I had to pay through the gills to get that roster. You couldn't have outbid me. Let's say my currency carries more sway. Money is money. I trade in information, Gills. The things men do when they think no one is looking. Shame holds more value than coin ever can. He was grandstanding, and Inej saw that, buying her time as she leaped over the slate shingles. Are you worried about the second guard? Good old Bert Van Dahl? Kaz asked. Maybe he's up there right now, wondering what he should do. Shoot me, shoot Holst, or maybe I got to him too, and he's getting ready to blow a hole in your chest, Gills. He leaned in, as if he and Gills were sharing a secret. Why not give Van Dahl the order and find out? Gills opened and closed his mouth like a carp, then bellowed, Van Dahl! Just as Van Dahl parted his lips to answer, Inej slipped up behind him and placed a blade to his throat. She'd barely had time to pick out the shadow and slide down the roof tiles. Saints, Kaz liked to cut it close. Shh, she whispered in Van Dahl's ear. She gave him a tiny jab in the side so he could feel the point of her second dagger pressed against his kidney. Please, he whined. I like it when men beg, she said, but this isn't the time for it. Below, she could see Gil's chest rising and falling with panicked breaths. Van Dahl, he shouted again. There was rage on his face when he turned back to Kaz. Always one step ahead, aren't you? Gills, when it comes to you, I'd say I have a running start. But Gills just smiled, a tiny smile, tight and satisfied. A victor's smile. Inej realised with fresh fear. 1 second, I'm going to have a little drink. The race isn't over yet. Gills reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy black pistol. Finally, Kaz said, the big reveal. Now Jesper can stop keening over Bollinger like a wet-eyed woman. Jesper stared at the gun with stunned, furious eyes. Bollinger searched him. Oh, Big Bol, you idiot, he groaned. Inej couldn't believe what she was saying. The guard in her arms released a tiny squeak. In her anger and surprise, she had accidentally tightened her grip. Relax, she said, easing her hold. But all saints, she wanted to put a knife through something. Big Bollinger had been the one to pat down Gills. There was no way he would have missed the pistol. He'd betrayed them. Was that why Kaz had insisted on bringing Big Bollinger here tonight? So he'd have public confirmation that Bollinger had gone over to the Black Tips. It was certainly why he'd let Holst put a bullet in Bollinger's gun. But so what? Now everyone knew Big Bol was a traitor. Kaz still had a gun pointed at his chest. Gil smirked. Kaz Brecker, the great escape artist. How are you going to wriggle your way out of this one? Going out the same way that I came in. Kaz ignored the pistol, turning his attention to the big man lying on the ground. Do you know what your problem is, Bollinger? He said, jabbing at the wound in Big Bol's stomach with the tip of his cane. That wasn't a rhetorical question. Do you know what your biggest problem is? Bond demurred. No. Give me a guess, Kaz hissed. Big Bowl said nothing, just released another trembling whimper. All right, I'll tell you. You're lazy. I know it, everyone knows it. So I had to ask myself why my laziest bouncer was getting up early twice a week to walk 2 extra miles to steal fries for breakfast, especially when the eggs are so much better at the Cooperon. Big Bowl becomes an early riser. The black tips start throwing their weight around the Fifth Harbour and then intercept our biggest shipment of Jurda. It wasn't a tough connection to make. He sighed and said to Gills, "This is what happens when stupid people start making big plans, yeah?" Doesn't matter much now, does it?" replied Gills. "This gets ugly. I'm shooting from close range. Maybe your guards get me or my guys, but no way you're going to dodge this bullet." Kaz stepped onto the barrel of the gun so that it was pressed directly against his chest. "No way at all, Gills." "You think I won't do it?" "Oh, I think you'll do it gladly, with a song in your black heart. But you won't, not tonight." Gil's finger twitched on the trigger. "Kaz," Jesper said, "this whole shoot me thing is starting to concern me." Ooman didn't bother to object to Whisper mouthing off this time. One man was down. Neutral territory had been violated. The sharp tang of gunpowder already hung in the air, and along with it a question, unspoken in the quiet, as if the Reaper himself had waited the answer. How much blood will be shed tonight? In the distance, a siren wailed. 19 burst at, Kaz said. Gills had been shifting slightly from one foot to another. Now he went very still. "That's your girl's address, isn't it, Gills?" Gills swallowed. "Don't have a girl." "Oh, yes, you do," crooned Kaz. "She's pretty too. Well, pretty enough for a fink like you. Seems sweet, you love her, don't you?" Even from the rooftop, Inej could see the sheen of sweat on Gil's waxen face. "Of course you do. No one that fine should have looked twice at a barrel scum like you. But she's different. She finds you charming. Sure sign of madness, if you ask me. But love is strange that way. Does she like to rest her pretty head on your shoulder, listen to you talk about your day?" Gills looked at Kaz as if he was finally seeing him for the first time. The boy he'd been talking to had been cocky, reckless, easily amused, but not frightening, not really. Now the monster was here, dead-eyed and unafraid. Kaz Brecker was gone, and Dirty Hands had come to see the rough work done. "She lives at 19 Burstrat," Kaz said in his gravelly rasp. 3 floors up, geraniums in the window boxes, and there are 2 dregs waiting outside her door right now. And if I don't walk out of here whole and feeling righteous, they will set that place alight from floor to rooftop. It will go up in seconds, burning from both ends, with poor Elise trapped in the middle. Her blonde hair will catch first, like the wick of a candle. "You're bluffing," said Gills, but his pistol hand was trembling. Kaz lifted his head and inhaled deeply. "Getting late now. You heard the siren. I smell the harbour on the wind. Sea and salt and maybe... Is that smoke I smell too?" There was pleasure in his voice. "Oh, saints, Kaz," Inej thought miserably. "What have you done now?" Again, Gil's finger twitched on the trigger, and Inej tensed. "I know, Gills, I know," Kaz said sympathetically. "All that planning and scheming and bribing for nothing. That's what you're thinking right now. How bad would it feel to walk home knowing what you've lost? How angry your boss is going to be when you show up empty-handed and that much poorer for it? How satisfying would it be to put a bullet in my heart? You could do it. Pull the trigger. We can all go down together. They could take our bodies out to the Reaper's barge for burning like all the paupers go. Or you could take your blow to your pride, go back to the burst rack, lay your head in your girl's lap, fall asleep still breathing, and dream of revenge. It's up to you, Gills. Do we all get to go home tonight?" Gills searched Kaz's gaze, and whatever he saw there made his shoulders sag. Inej was surprised to feel a pang of pity for him. He'd walked up to this place buoyed on bravado, a survivor, a champion of the barrel. He'd leave as another victim of Kaz Brecker. "You'll get what's coming to you someday, Brecker." "I will," said Kaz, "and if there's any justice in the world, and we'll all know how likely that is." Gills let his arms drop, The pistol hung uselessly by his side. Kaz stepped back, brushing the front of his shirt where the gun barrel had rested. Go and tell your general to keep the black tips out of Fifth Harbour and that we expect him to make amends for the shipment of Jerda we lost, plus 5% for drawing steel on neutral ground and 5% more for being such a spectacular bunch of arses. Then Kaz's cane swung in a sharp arc. Gil screamed as his wrist bones shattered. The gun clattered to the paving stones. I stood down, cried Gills, cradling his hand. I stood down. You draw on me again, I'll break both your wrists, and you'll have to hire someone to help you to take the piss. Kaz tipped the brim of his hat up with the head of his cane. Or maybe you can get that lovely Elise to do it for you. Kaz crouched down beside Bollinger. The big man whimpered. Look at me, Bollinger. Assuming you don't bleed to death tonight, you have until sunset tomorrow to get out of Ketterdam. I hear you're anywhere near the city limits, and they'll find you stuffed in a keg at Silla's Fry. Then he looked at Gills. You help Bollinger, or I find out he's running with the black tips. Don't think I won't come after you. Please, Kaz, moaned Bollinger. You had a home, and you put a wrecking ball through the front door, Bollinger. Don't look for sympathy from me. He rose and checked his pocket watch. I didn't expect this to go on so long. I'd best be on my way, or poor Elise will be getting a trifle warm. Gil shook his head. There's something wrong with you, Brecker. I don't know what you are, but you're not made right. Kaz cocked his head to one side. You're from the suburbs, aren't you, Gills? Came to the city to try your luck? He smoothed his lapel with one gloved hand. Well, I'm the kind of bastard they only manufacture in the barrel. Despite the loaded gun at the black tip's feet, Kaz turned his back on them and limped across the cobblestones towards the eastern arch. Jesper squatted down next to Bollinger and gave him a gentle pat on the cheek. Idiot, he said sadly, and followed Kaz out of the exchange. From the roof, Inej continued to watch as Uman picked up and holstered Gil's guns, and the black tips said a few quiet words to each other. Don't leave, Big Bollinger begged. Don't leave me. He tried to cling onto the cuff of Gil's trousers. Gil shook him off. They left him cold on his side, leaking blood onto the cobblestones. Inej plucked Van Daal's rifle from his hands before she released him. Go home, she told the guard. He cast a single terrified glance over his shoulder and sprinted off down the walkway. Far below, Big Boller started trying to drag himself across the floor of the exchange. He might be stupid enough to cross Kaz Brecker, but he'd survived this long in the barrel, and that took will. He might make it. Help him, a voice inside her said. Until a few moments ago, he'd been a brother in arms. It seemed wrong to leave him alone. She could go to him, offer to put him out of his misery quickly, hold his hand as he passed. She could fetch a medic to save him. Instead, she spoke a quick prayer in the language of her saints and began the steep climb down the outer wall. Inej pitied the boy who might die alone with no one to comfort him in his last hours, or who might live and spend his life as an exile. But the night's work wasn't over yet, and the Wraith didn't have time for traitors. So that was chapter 2 of 6 of Crows. The next chapter is called Kaz, so that'll be probably focused on the young man that we've just seen here in the harbour. If you enjoyed it, please give us a like, please comment below, and we will see you again next week. Hi everyone, hope you all had a really good weekend, and welcome to Storytime. So my name's Georgia and I'm a conversation starter at the Yard, and we are reading 6 of Crows. So far we have read 2 chapters. In the first chapter we met Just, not 100% sure how to pronounce his name, but he is a guard who works at a merchant's house, and we were introduced to Grishas, who are like sort of magic using servants. And then in the second chapter we met Kaz, Inej, Jesper, who were all part of the Dregs gang, and they had a sort of confrontation standoff with someone in like an opposing gang, and came out on top, of course. And so in the third chapter, it's a continuation of that, and it is mostly focused on Kaz, who is the leader of that gang. So if you're there, sat, you got your cup of tea, you got your coffee, you got a drink, okay. Cheers greeted Kaz as he emerged from the eastern arch, Jesper trailing behind him and, if Kaz was any judge, already working himself into a sulk. Dirks, Rotty and the others charged at them, whooping and shouting, Jesper's revolvers held aloft. The crew had got the barest glimpse of the proceedings with Gills, but they'd heard most of it. Now they were chanting, "The Burstratz is on fire! The Dregs don't have no water!" "I can't believe he just turned tail," jeered Rotty. "He had a loaded pistol in his hand." "Tell us what you had on the guard, do expect. Can't be the usual stuff." "I heard about a guy in Slocken who used to roll around in apple syrup and then get too—" "I'm not talking," said Kaz. "Holt could prove useful in the future." The mood was jittery, and their laughter had the frantic serration that came with near disaster. Some of them had expected a fight and were still itching for one. But Kaz knew that there was more to it, and he hadn't missed the fact that no one had mentioned Big Bollinger's name. They'd been badly shaken by his betrayal, both the revelation and the way that Kaz had delivered punishment. Beneath all of that jostling and whooping, there was fear. Good. Kaz relied on the fact that the Dregs were all murderers, thieves and liars. He just had to make sure that they didn't have a habit of lying to him. Kaz dispatched 2 of them to keep an eye on Big Bol and to make sure that if he did make it to his feet, he had left the city. The rest could return to the Slat and the Crow Club to drink off their worry, make some trouble, and spread word of the night's events. They'd tell what they'd seen, embroider the rest, and with every retelling, Dirty Hands would get crazier and more ruthless. But Kaz had business to attend to, and his first stop would be Fifth Harbour. Jesper stepped into his path. "You should have let me know about Big Bollinger," he said in a furious whisper. "Don't tell me my business, Jez. Do you think I'm dirty too? If I thought you were dirty, you'd be holding your guts in on the floor of the exchange like Big Bol, so stop running your mouth." Jesper shook his head and rested his hands on the revolvers he'd reclaimed from Dirks. Whenever he got cranky, he liked to lay his hands on a gun, like a child seeking the comfort of a favoured doll. It would have been easy enough to make peace. Kaz could have told Jesper that he knew he wasn't dirty, reminded him that he trusted him enough to make him his only real second in a fight that could have gone badly wrong tonight. Instead he said, "Go on, Jesper, there's a line of credit waiting for you at the Crow Club. Play till morning or your luck runs out, whichever comes first." Jesper scowled, but he couldn't keep the hungry gleam from his eye. "Another bribe? I'm a creature of habit." "Lucky for you, I am too." He hesitated long enough to say, "You don't want us with you? Gills's boys are going to be rolled after that." "Let them come," Kaz said, and turned down Nemstrat without another word. "If you couldn't walk by yourself through Ketterdam after dark, you might as well just hang a sign that read "soft" around your neck and lie down for a beating." He could feel the Dregs' eyes on his back as he headed over the bridge. He didn't need to hear their whispers to know what they would say. They wanted to drink with him, hear him explain how he'd known Big Bollinger had gone over to the Black Tips, listen to him describe the look in Gill's eyes when he dropped the pistol. But they'd never get it from Kaz, and if they didn't like it, they could find another crew to run with. No matter what they thought of him, they'd walk a little taller tonight. It was why they stayed, why they gave their best approximation of loyalty for him. When he had officially become a member of the Dregs, he'd been 12, and the gang had been a laughingstock, street kids and washed-up cadgers running shell games and penny-poor cons out of a run-down house in the worst part of the Barrel. But he hadn't needed a great gang, just one he could make great, one that needed him. Now they had their own territory, their own gambling hall, and that run-down house had become the Slat, a dry, warm place to get a hot meal or hole up when you were wounded. Now the dregs were feared. Kaz had given them that. He didn't owe them small talk on top of that. Besides, Jesper was smooth all over. A few drinks in and a few hands up and the sharpshooter's good nature would return. He held a grudge about as well as he held his liquor, and he had a gift for making Kaz's victories sound like they belonged to everyone. As Kaz headed down one of the little canals that would take him past Fifth Harbour, he realised he felt saints. He felt almost hopeful. Maybe he should see a medic. The black tips had been nipping at his heels for weeks, and now he'd forced them to play their hand. His leg wasn't too bad either, despite the winter chill. The ache was always there, but tonight it was just a dull throb. Still, a part of him wondered if the parlay was some sort of test Pascal had set for him. Pascal was perfectly capable of convincing himself that he was the genius making the dregs prosper, especially if one of his cronies was whispering in his ear. That idea didn't sit easy, but Kaz could worry about Pascal tomorrow. For now, he'd make sure everything was running on schedule at the harbour, and then head home to the slat for much-needed sleep. He knew Inej was shadowing him. She'd been with him all the way from the exchange. He didn't call out to her. She would make herself visible when she was good and ready. Usually he liked the quiet. In fact, he would have happily sewn most people's lips shut. But when she wanted to, Inej had a way of making you feel her silence. It tugged at your edges. Kaz managed to endure it all the way past the iron railings of Zent's Bridge, the grating covered in little bits of rope tied in elaborate knots, sailors' prayers for safe return from sea. Superstitious rot. Finally he gave in and said, "Spit it out already, Rafe." Her voice came from the dark. "You didn't send anyone to Burstrat." "Why would I?" "If Gills doesn't get there in time." "No one's setting fires at 19 Burstrat." "I heard the siren." "A happy accident. I take inspiration where I find it." "You were bluffing then. She was never in any danger." Kaz shrugged, unwilling to give her an answer. Inej was always trying to wring little bits of decency from him. When everyone knows you're a monster, you needn't waste time doing every monstrous thing. "Why did you even agree to the meet if you knew it was a setup?" She was somewhere to the right of him, moving without a sound. He had heard other members of the gang say that she moved like a cat, but he suspected cats would sit attentively at her feet to learn her methods. "I'd call the night a success," he said. "Wouldn't you?" "You were nearly killed. So was Jesper." Gills emptied the black tip's coffers, paying useless bribes. "We've outed a traitor, re-established our claim on Fifth Harbour, and I don't have a scratch on me. It was a good night." "How long have you known about Big Bollinger?" "Weeks. We're going to be short-staffed." That reminds me. Let Rahaki go." "Why? There's no one like him at the tables." Lots of sobs know their way around a deck of cards. Rahaki is a little too quick. He's skimming. "He's a good dealer. He has a family to provide for. You could give him a warning, take a finger. Then he wouldn't be a good dealer anymore, would he?" When a dealer was caught skimming money from a gambling hall, the floor boss would cut off one of his pinky fingers. It was one of those ridiculous punishments that had somehow become codified in gangs. It threw off the skimmer's balance, forced him to relearn his shuffle, and showed any future employer that he had to be watched. But it also made him clumsy at the tables. It meant he was focusing on simple things like the mechanics of the deal instead of watching the players. Kaz couldn't see Inej's face in the dark, but he sensed her disapproval. "Greed is your god, Kaz." He almost laughed at that. "No, Inej, greed bows to me. It is my servant and my lever." "And what god do you serve then?" "Whichever will grant me good fortune." "I don't think gods work that way." "I don't think I care." She blew out an exasperated breath. Despite everything she'd been through, Inej still believed her silly saints were watching over her. Kaz knew it, and for some reason he loved to rile her. He wished he could read her expression now. There was always something so satisfying about the little furrow between her black brows. "How did you know I would get to Vandal in time?" she asked. "Because you always do." "You should have given me more warning. I thought your saints would appreciate the challenge." For a while she said nothing, and then from somewhere behind him he heard her. "Men mock the gods until they need them, Kaz." He didn't see her go, only sensed her absence. Kaz gave an irritated shake of his head. To say he trusted Inej would be stretching the point, but he could admit to himself that he had come to rely on her heavily. It had been a gut decision to pay off her indenture with the menagerie, and it had cost the dregs sorely. Per Haskell had needed convincing, but Inej was one of the best investments Kaz had ever made. That she was so very good at remaining unseen made her an excellent thief of secrets, the best in the barrel. But the fact that she simply could erase herself bothered him. She didn't even have a scent. All people carried scents, and those scents told stories. The hint of carbolic on a woman's fingers, or wood smoke in her hair, the wet wool of a man's suit, or the tinge of gunpowder lingering in his shirt cuffs. But not Inej. She'd somehow mastered invisibility. She was a valuable asset. So why couldn't she just do her job and spare him her moods? Suddenly, Kaz knew he wasn't alone. He paused, listening. He cut through a tight alley, split by a murky canal. There were no street lamps here, and little foot traffic, nothing but the bright moon and the small boats bumping against their moorings. He had dropped his guard, let his mind give in to distraction. A man's shape appeared at the head of the alley. "What business?" Kaz asked. The shape lunged at him. Kaz swung his cane in a low arc. It should have made direct contact with his attacker's legs, but instead it sailed through empty space. Kaz stumbled, thrown off balance by the force of his swing. Then, somehow, the man was standing right in front of him. A fist connected with Kaz's jaw. Kaz shook off the stars that rocketed through his head. He spun around and swung again, but there was no one there. The weighted head of Kaz's stick whooshed through nothing and cracked against the wall. Kaz felt the cane torn from his hands by someone on his right. Was there more than one of him? And then a man stepped through the wall. Kaz's mind stuttered and reeled, trying to explain what he was seeing as a cluster of mist became a cloak, boots, the pale flash of a face. Ghosts, Kaz thought. A boy's fear, but it came with absolute surety. Geordie had come for his vengeance at last. "It's time to pay for your debts, Kaz. You never got something for nothing." The thought passed through Kaz's mind in a humiliating, gibbering wave of panic. Then the phantom was upon him, and he felt a sharp jab of a needle in his neck. A ghost with a syringe? Fooled, he thought, and then he was in dark. Kaz woke to the sharp scent of ammonia. His head jerked back as he fully returned to consciousness. The old man in front of him wore the robes of a university medic. He had a bottle of woofed salts in his hand that was wavering beneath Kaz's nose. The stink was nearly unbearable. "Get away from me," Kaz rasped. The medic eyed him dispassionately, returning the woof salts to their leather pouch. Kaz flexed his fingers, but that was all he could do. He'd been shackled to a chair with his arms behind his back. Whatever they'd injected him with had left him groggy. The medic moved aside, and Kaz blinked twice, trying to clear his vision and make sense of the absurd luxury of his surroundings. He'd expected to wake in the den of the Blacktips or some other rival gang. But this wasn't cheap barrel flash. A squat decked out like this took real money. Mahogany panels dense with carvings of frothing waves and flying fish, shelves lined with books, leaded windows, and he was fairly sure there was a real decapple. One of those demure oil portraits of a lady with a book open in her lap and a lamb laying at her feet. The man observing him from behind a broad desk had the prosperous look of a merchant. But if this was his house, why were armed members of the Stadwatch guarding the door? Damn it, Kaz thought. Am I under arrest? If so, this much was in for a surprise. Thanks to Inej, he had information on every judge, bailiff, and high councilman in Kerch. He'd be out of his cell before sunrise, except he wasn't in a cell. He was chained to a chair. So what the hell was going on? The man was in his 40s with a gaunt but handsome face and hairline making a determined retreat from his forehead. When Kaz met his gaze, the man cleared his throat and pressed his lips together. Mr. Brecker, I hope you're not feeling too poorly. Get this old cranker away from me. I feel fine. The merch gave a nod to the medic. You may go. Please send me your bill. And I would, of course, appreciate your discretion in this matter. The medic secured his bag and exited the room. As he did, the merchant rose and picked up a sheaf of papers from his desk. He wore the perfectly cut frock coat and vest of all the Kerch merchants. Dark, refined, deliberately staid. But the pocket watch and tie-pin told Kaz all he needed to know. Heavy links of laurel leaves made up the watch's gold fob, and the pin was a massive, perfect ruby. I'm going to pry that fat jewel from its setting and jab the pin right through your merchant neck for chaining me to a chair, Kaz thought. But all he said was, Van Eck. The man nodded. No bow, of course. Merchants didn't need to bow to scum from the barrel. You know me then? Kaz knew all the symbols and jewels from all the Kerch merchant houses. Van Eck's crest was the red laurel. It didn't take a professor to make the connection. I know you, he said. You're one of those merch crusaders always trying to clean up the barrel. Van Eck gave another small nod. I try to find men, honest work. Kaz laughed. What's the difference between wagering at the Crow Club and speculating on the floor of the exchange? One is theft and the other is commerce. When a man loses his money, he may have trouble telling them apart. The barrel is a den of filth, vice, violence. How many of the ships you send sailing out the Kessan harbours never return? That doesn't. 1 out of 5, Van Eck. 1 out of 5 vessels you send seeking coffee and Jerda and bolts of silk sinks to the bottom of the sea, crashes on the rocks, falls prey to pirates, 1 of the 5 crews dead, their bodies lost to foreign waters, food for deep sea fishes. Let's not speak of violence. I won't argue ethics with a stripling from the barrel. Kaz didn't really expect him to. He was just stalling for time as he tested the tightness of the cuffs around his wrists. He let his fingers feel along the length of the chain as far as they were able, still puzzling out where Van Eck had brought him. Though Kaz had never met the man himself, he'd had cause to learn the layout of Van Eck's house, inside and out. Wherever they were, it wasn't the merchant's mansion. Since you didn't bring me here to philosophise, what business? It was the question spoken at the opening of any meeting. A greeting from a peer, not a plea from a prisoner. I have a proposition for you. Rather, the council does. Kaz hid his surprise. Does the Merchant Council begin all negotiations with a beating? Consider it a warning and a demonstration. Kaz remembered the shape from the alley, the way it had appeared and disappeared like a ghost. Geordie. He gave himself an internal shake. Not Geordie, you podge. Focus. They'd nabbed him because he'd been flushed off a victory and distracted. This was his punishment, and it wasn't a mistake he'd make it again. That doesn't explain the phantom. For now, he pushed the thought aside. What possible use could the Merchant Council have for me? Van Eck thumbed through the papers in his hand. You were first arrested at 10, he said, scanning the page. Everyone remembers his first time. Twice again in that year, twice at 11. You were picked up on the Stadwatch, roused at a gambling hall when you were 14, but you haven't served any time since. It was true. No one had managed to pinch on Kaz in 3 years. I cleaned up, Kaz said. Found honest work. Live a life of industry and prayer. Don't blaspheme, Vanek said mildly, but his eyes flashed briefly with anger. A man of faith, Kaz noted, as his mind sorted through everything he knew about Vanek. Prosperous, pious, a widower, recently remarried to a bride not much older than Kaz himself. And of course there was the mystery of Vanek's son. Vanek continued paging through the file. You run book on prize fights, horses, and your own games of chance. You've been floor boss at the Crow Club for more than 2 years. You're the youngest to ever run a betting shop, and you've doubled its profits in that time. You're a blackmailer. I broker information. A con artist. I create opportunity. A fraud and a murderer. I don't run whores, I kill for a cause. And what cause is that? Same as yours, Murch. Profit. How do you get your information, Mr. Brecker? You might say I'm a lockpick. You must be a very gifted one. I am indeed, Kaz leaned back slightly. You see, every man is a safe, a vault of secrets and longings. Now, there are those who take the brute's way, but I prefer a gentler approach. The right pressure applied at the right moment in the right place. It's a delicate thing. Do you always speak in metaphors, Mr. Brecker? Kaz smiled. It's not a metaphor. He was out of his chair before the chains hit the ground. He leaped over the desk, snatching a letter opener from its surface in one hand and catching hold of the front of Vanek's shirt with the other. The fine fabric bunched as he pressed the blade to Vanek's throat. Kaz was dizzy and his limbs felt creaky from being trapped in the chair, but everything seemed sunnier with a weapon in his hand. Vanek's guards were facing him, all with guns and swords drawn. He could feel the Murcher's heart pounding beneath the wool of his suit. I don't think I need to waste breath on threats, Kaz said. Tell me how to get to the door, or I'm taking you through the window with me. I think I can change your mind. Kaz gave him a little jostle. I don't care who you are or how big that ruby is. You don't take me from my own streets. You don't try and take a deal with me while I'm in chains. Mika, Vanek called, and then it happened again. A boy walked through the library wall. He was pale as a corpse and wore an embroidered blue Grisha tide-maker's coat with red and gold ribbon at the lapel, indicating his association with Vanek's house. But not even Grisha could stroll through a wall. Drugged, Kaz thought, trying not to panic. I've been drugged. Or this was some kind of illusion, the kind they performed in the theatres off East Ave. A girl cut in half, doves from a teapot. What the hell is this? He growled. Let me go and I'll explain. You can explain right where you are. Vanek huffed a short, shaky breath. What you're seeing are the effects of a Jurda Parem. Jurda is just a stimulant. The dried little blossoms were grown in Novy Yem and sold in shops all over Kestam. In his early days in the dregs, Kaz had chewed them to stay alert during stakeouts. It had stained his teeth orange for days after. It's harmless, he said. Jurda Parem is something completely different, and it is most certainly not harmless. So you did drug me? Not you, Mr. Brecker. Mika. Kaz took in the sickly pallor of the Grisha's face. He had dark hollows beneath his eyes and the fragile, trembling build of someone who had missed several meals and didn't seem to care. Jurda Parem is a cousin to ordinary Jurda, Vanek continued. It comes from the same plant. We're not sure of the process by which the drug is made, but a sample of it was sent to the Kerch Merchant Council by a scientist named Bo Young Bahir. Shu? Yes, he wished to defect, so he sent us a sample to convince us of his claims regarding the drug's extraordinary effects. Please, Mr. Brecker, this is a most uncomfortable position. If you'd like, I will give you a pistol, and then we can sit and discuss this in a more civilized fashion. a pistol and my cane. Vanek gestured to one of his guards, who exited the room and returned a moment later with Kaz's walking stick. Kaz was just glad he used the damn door. Pistol first, Kaz said, slowly. The guard unholstered his weapon and handed it to Kaz by the grip. Kaz grabbed and cocked it in one quick movement, then released Vanek, tossed the letter opener onto the desk, and snatched his cane from the guard's hand. The pistol was more useful, but the cane brought Kaz a sense of relief he didn't care to quantify. Vanek took a few steps backwards, putting distance between himself and Kaz's loaded gun. He didn't seem eager to sit. Neither was Kaz, so he kept close to the window, ready to bolt if need be. Vanek took a deep breath and tried to set his suit to rights. That cane is quite a piece of hardware, Mr. Brecker. Is it fabricator made? It was, in fact, the work of a Grisha fabricator, lead-lined and perfectly weighted for breaking bones. None of your business. Get talking, Vanek. The merchant cleared his throat. One bowl young vieux sent us a sample of Dieu de Pirem. We fed it to 3 Grisha, one from each order. Happy volunteers? Indentures, Vanek conceded. The first 2 were a fabricator and a healer indentured to Councilman Hode. Mika is a tide maker. He's mine. You've seen what he can do using the drug. Hode. Why did that name ring a bell? I don't know what I've seen, Kaz said as he glanced at Mika. The boy's gaze was focused intently on Vanek, as if awaiting his next command, or maybe another fix. An ordinary tide maker can control currents, summon water or moisture from the air or nearby source. They manage the tides in our harbour. But under the influence of Dieu de Pirem, a tide maker can alter his own state from solid to liquid to gas and back again, and do the same with other objects, even a wall. Kaz was tempted to deny it, but he couldn't explain what he'd just seen any other way. How? It's hard to say. You're aware of the amplifiers some Grisha wear. I've seen them, Kaz said. Animal bones, teeth, scales. I hear they're hard to come by. Very, but they only increase a Grisha's power. Dieu de Pirem alters a Grisha's perception. So, Grisha can manipulate matter at its most fundamental levels. They call it the small science. Under the influence of Pirem, those manipulators become faster and far more precise. In theory, Dieu de Pirem is just a stimulant like its ordinary cousin, but it seems to sharpen and hone a Grisha's senses. They can make connections with extraordinary speed. Things become possible that simply shouldn't be. What does it do to sorry sobs like you and me? Vanek seemed to bristle slightly at being lumped in with Kaz, but he said, it's lethal. An ordinary mind cannot tolerate Pirem, even in the lowest doses. You said you gave it to 3 Grisha. What can the others do? Here, Vanek said, reaching for a drawer in his desk. Kaz lifted his pistol. Easy. With exaggerated slowness, Vanek slid his hand into the desk drawer and pulled out a lump of gold. This started as lead. Like hell it did. Vanek shrugged. I can only tell you what I saw. The fabricator took a piece of lead into his hands, and moments later we had this. How do you know it's even real? Asked Kaz. It has the same melting point as gold, the same weight and malleability. If it's not identical to gold in every way, the difference has eluded us. Have it tested if you like. Kaz tucked his cane under his arm and took the heavy lump from Vanek's hand. He slipped it into his pocket. Whether it was real or just a convincing imitation, a chunk of yellow that big could buy plenty on the streets of the Barrel. You could have got that anywhere, Kaz pointed out. I would bring Hode's fabricator here to show you himself, but he isn't well. Kaz's gaze flickered to Mika's sickly face and damp brow. The drug clearly came with a price. Let's say this is all true and not cheap coin trick magic. What does it have to do with me? Let's say perhaps you have heard of the Shu paying off the entirety of their debt to Kerch with a sudden influx of gold, the assassination of the trade ambassador from Novoye Zem, the theft of documents from a military base in Ravka. So that was the secret behind the murder of the ambassador in the washroom, and the gold in those 3 Shu ships must have been fabricator made. Kaz hadn't heard anything about the Ravkan documents, but he nodded anyway. We believe all of these occurrences are the work of Grisha under the control of the Shu government and under the influence of Gerda Perem. Vanek scrubbed a hand over his jaw. Mr. Brecker, I want you to think for a moment about what I'm telling you. Men who can walk through walls, no vault or fortress will ever be safe again. People who can make gold from lead or anything else, for that matter, who can alter the very material of the world. Financial markets would be thrown into chaos. The world economy would collapse. Very exciting. What is it you want from me, Vanek? You want me to steal a shipment, the formula? No. I want you to steal the man. Kidnap Bolyan Vieux. Save him. A month ago, we received a message from Yorbia begging for asylum. He was concerned about his government's plans for Gerda Perem, and we agreed to help him defect. We set out a rendezvous, but there was a skirmish at the drop point. With the Shu? No, with the Fjordans. Kaz frowned. The Fjordans must have spies deep in Shuhan, or Kerch if they had learned anything about the drug and Volbayer's plan so quickly. So send some of your agents after him. The diplomatic situation is somewhat delicate. It is essential that our government not be tied to Yorbia in any way. You have to know he's probably dead. The Fjordans hate Grisha. There's no way they'd let knowledge of this drug get out. Our sources say he is very much alive and that he is awaiting trial. Vanek cleared his throat. At the ice court. Kaz stared at Vanek for a long minute, then burst out laughing. Well, it's been a pleasure being knocked unconscious and taken captive by you, Vanek. You can be sure your hospitality will be repaid when the time is right. Now have one of your lackeys show me the door. We're prepared to offer you 5 million Kruger. Kaz pocketed the pistol. He wasn't afraid for his life now, just irritated that this Fink had wasted his time. This may come as a surprise to you, Vanek, but we canal rats value our lives just as much as you do yours. 10 million. There's no point to a fortune I won't be alive to spend. Where's my hat? Did your tide maker leave it behind in the alley? 20. Kaz paused. He had the eerie sense that the carved fish on the walls had halted mid-leap to listen. 20 million Kruger. Vanek nodded. He didn't look happy. I'd need to convince a team to walk into a suicide mission. That won't come cheap. Despite what he'd said to Vanek, there were plenty of people in the barrel who didn't have much to live for. 20 million Kruger is hardly cheap, Vanek snapped. The ice courts have never been breached. That's why we need you, Mr. Brecker. It's possible Bolvar is already dead or he's given up all of his secrets to the Fjordans, but we think that we have at least a little time to act before the secret of Gerda Perem is put into play. If the Shu have the formula, Yolbier claimed he'd managed to mislead his superiors and keep the specifics of the formula secret. We think they're operating from whatever limited supply Yolbier left behind. Greed bows to me. Maybe Kaz had been a little too cocky on that front. Now greed was doing Vanek's bidding. The lever was at work, overcoming Kaz's resistance, moving him into place. 20 million Kruger. What kind of job would this be? Kaz didn't know anything about espionage or government squabbles, but why was stealing Bolvar from the Ice Corps be any different from liberating valuables from a merchant safe? The most well-protected safe in the world, he reminded himself. He'd need a very specialised team, a desperate team, who wouldn't balk at the real possibility that they'd never come back from this job. And he wouldn't be able to pull just from the dregs. He didn't have the talent he'd need in their ranks. That means that he'd have to watch his back more than usual. But if they managed it, even after Pascal had got his cut, Kaz's share of the scrub would be enough to change everything, to finally put into motion the dream he'd had since he'd first crawled out of a cold harbour with revenge burning a hole in his heart. His debt to Geordie would be paid at last. There would be other benefits too. The Church Council would owe him, to say nothing of what this particular heist would do for his reputation. To infiltrate the impenetrable ice core and snatch a prize from the bastion of Fjordan nobility and military might. With a job like this under his belt and that kind of scrub at his fingertips, he wouldn't need Pascal anymore. He could start his own operation. But something was off. Why me? Why the drugs? There are more experienced crews out there. Mika started to cough and Kaz saw blood on his sleeve. Sit, Vanek instructed gently, helping Mika into a chair and offering the Grisha his handkerchief. He signalled to a guard. Some water. Well, prodded Kaz. How old are you, Mr. Becker? 17. You haven't been arrested since you were 14, and since I know you are not an honest man any more than you are an honest boy, I can only assume you have the quality I need most in a criminal. You don't get caught. Vanek smiled slightly then. There's also the matter of my de Capelle. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. 6 months ago, a decapel oil worth nearly 100,000 Kruger disappeared from my home. Quite a loss. It was, especially since I'd been assured that my gallery was impenetrable and that the locks on its doors were foolproof. I do seem to remember reading about that. Yes, admitted Vanek with a small sigh. Pride is a perilous thing. I was eager to show off my acquisition and the lengths I'd gone to in order to protect it. And yet, despite all of my safeguards, despite dogs and alarms and the most loyal staff in all of Ketterdam, my painting is gone. My condolences. It has yet to surface anywhere on the world market. Maybe your thief already had a buyer lined up. A possibility, of course, but I'm inclined to believe the thief took it for a different reason. What would that be? Just to prove that he could. Seems like a stupid risk to me. Well, who else can guess at the motives of thieves? Not me, certainly. From what I know of the Ice Court, whoever stole my de Capelle is exactly who I need for this job. Then you'd be better off hiring him or her. Indeed, but I'll have to settle for you. Vanek held Kaz's gaze as if he hoped to find a confession written between his eyes. At last, Vanek asked, We have a deal then? Not so fast. What about the healer? Vanek looked baffled. Who? You said you gave the drugs to a Grisha from each order. Mika's a tide maker. He's your ethereal nick. The fabricator who mocked up your gold was a material nick. So what happened to the corporal nick, the healer? Vanek winced slightly, but simply said, Will you accompany me, Mr. Becker? Warily, keeping an eye on Mika and the guards, Kaz followed Vanek out of the library and down the hall. The house dripped with merchant wealth, walls panelled in dark wood, floors tiled in clean black and white, all in good taste, all perfectly restrained and impeccably crafted. But it had the feel of a graveyard. The rooms were deserted, the curtains drawn, the furniture covered in white sheets so that each shadowy chamber they passed looked like some kind of forgotten seascape cluttered with icebergs. Hode. Now the name clicked into place. There had been some kind of incident at Hode's mansion on the Geldstraat last week. The whole place had been cordoned off and crawling with Stadwatch. Kaz had heard rumours of a firepox outbreak, and even Inej hadn't been able to learn more. This is Councilman Hode's house, Kaz said, skin crawling. He wanted no part of the plague, but the merchant's guards didn't seem remotely concerned. I thought this place was under quarantine. What happened here is no danger to us. And if you do your job, Mr. Brecker, it never will be. Vanek led him through a door and into a manicured garden, thick with the new nectar scent of early crocuses. The smell hit Kaz like a blow to the jaw. Memories of Geordie were already too fresh in his mind, and for a moment Kaz wasn't walking through the canal-side garden with rich Murch. He was knee-deep in spring grasses, hot sun beating down his cheeks, his brother's voice calling him home. Kaz gave himself a shake. I need a mug of the darkest, bitterest coffee I can find, he thought, or maybe a real punch to the jaw. Van Eyck was leading him to a boathouse that faced the canal. The light filtering out between its shuttered windows cast patterns on the garden path. A single sea guard stood at attention beside the door as Van Eyck slid a key from his pocket and into the heavy lock. Kaz put his sleeve up to his mouth as a stink from the closed-up room reached him. Urine, excrement, so much for spring crocuses. The room was lit by 2 glass lanterns on the wall. A group of guards stood facing a large iron box, shattered glass littering the floor at their feet. Some wore the purple uniform of the Stad Watch, others the sea green livery of the Hode House. Through what Kaz now understood had been an observation window, he saw another city guard standing in front of an empty table and 2 overturned chairs. Like the others, the guard stood with his arms loose at his sides, face blank, eyes forwards, gazing at nothing. Van Eyck turned up the light on one of the lanterns, and Kaz saw a body in a purple uniform slumped on the floor, eyes closed. Van Eyck sighed and crouched down to turn the body over. We've lost another, he said. The boy was young, the bare scraps of a moustache on his upper lip. Van Eyck gave orders to the guard who had let them in, and with help from one of Van Eyck's guards, they lifted the corpse and took it from the room. The other guards didn't react, just continued to stare ahead. Kaz recognised one of them, Henrik Darman, the captain of the Stead Watch. Darman? He queried, but the man made no response. Kaz waved a hand in front of the captain's face, then gave him a hard flick on the ear. Nothing but a slow, disinterested blink. Kaz raised his pistol and aimed it directly at the captain's forehead. He cocked the hammer. The captain didn't flinch, didn't react. His pupils didn't contract. He's as good as dead, Van Eyck said. Shoot, blow his brains out. He won't protest and the others won't react. Kaz loaded his weapon, a chill setting deep into his bones. What is this? What happened to them? The Grisha was Corporal Nick, serving her indenture with Councilman Hode's household. He thought because she was a healer and not a heartrender, he was making the safest choice to test the param. Seemed smart enough. Kaz has seen heartrenders at work. They could rupture your cells, burst your heart in your chest, steal the breath from your lungs, or lower your pulse so that you dropped into a coma, all while never laying a finger on you. If even a part of what Van Eyck said was true, the idea of one of them dosed with Jeliparam was a daunting proposition. So the Murchers had tried the drug on a healer instead, but apparently things hadn't gone to plan. You gave her the drug and she killed her master? Not exactly, Van Eyck said, clearing his throat. They had her in that observation cell. Within seconds of consuming the param, she took control of the guard inside the chamber. How? We don't know exactly, but whatever method she used, it allowed her to subdue those guards as well. That's not possible, isn't it? The brain is just one more organ, a cluster of cells and impulses. Why shouldn't a Grisha, under the influence of Jeliparam, be able to manipulate those impulses? Kaz's disbelief must have shown. Look at these people, Van Eyck insisted. She told them all to wait. And that's exactly what they've done. That's all they've done since. Kaz studied the silent group more closely. Their eyes weren't blank or dead. Their bodies weren't quite at rest. They were expectant. He suppressed a shiver. He'd seen peculiar things, extraordinary things, but nothing like what he'd witnessed tonight. What happened to Hode? She commanded him to open the door, and when he did, she ordered him to cut the thumb from his hand. We only know how it all happened because the kitchen boy was present. The Grisha girl left him untouched, but he claims Hode carved away his own thumb, smiling all the while. Kaz didn't like the idea of some Grisha moving things around in his head, but he wouldn't be surprised if Hode deserved what he got. During Ravka's civil war, a lot of Grisha had fled the fighting and paid their way to Kerch by cunning indentures, and without realising it, they'd essentially sold themselves into slavery. The Merch is dead. Councilman Hode has lost a great deal of blood, but he's in the same state these men. He's been removed to the country with his family and the staff from his house. Did the Grisha healer go back to Ravka? Kaz asked. Vanek gestured Kaz out of the eerie boathouse and locked the door behind them. She may have attempted it, he said as they retraced their steps through the garden and along the side of the house. We know she secured a small craft, and we suspect she was headed to Ravka, but we found her body washed up 2 days ago near the third harbour. We think she drowned, trying to get back into the city. Why would she come back here? For more Jeddah Perem. Kaz thought of Mika's glittering eyes and waxy skin. It's that addictive. Seems to only take one dose. Once the drug has run its course, it leaves the Grisha's body weakened and the craving is intense. It's quite debilitating. Quite debilitating seemed like a bit of an understatement. The Council of Tides controlled entry to the Ketterdam harbours. If the drugged healer had tried to return at night in a small boat, she wouldn't have had much of a chance against the current. Kaz thought of Mika's gaunt face, the way his clothes hung from his body. The drug had already done that to him. If he'd been high in Jeddah Perem and already greedy for the next dose, he'd also looked ready to keel over. How long could a Grisha go on that way? It was an interesting question, but not relevant to the matter at hand. They'd arrived at the front gate. It was time to settle up. 30 million Kruger, Kaz said. We said 20, sputtered Vanek. You said 20. It's clear you're desperate. Kaz glanced back in the direction of the boathouse, where a room full of men simply waited to die. And now I see why. The council will have my head. They'll sing your praises once you have Anya safely hidden away wherever you intend to keep him. No visiem. Kaz shrugged. You could put him in a coffee pot for all I care. Vanek's gaze locked on his. You've seen what this drug can do. I assure you this is the beginning. If Jeddah Perem is unleashed on the world, war is inevitable. Our trade lines will be destroyed and our markets will collapse. Kerch will not survive it. Our hopes rest with you, Mr. Brecker. If you fail, all of the world will suffer for it. Oh, it's worse than that, Vanek. If I fail, I don't get paid. The look of disgust on the merchant's face was something that deserved its own decapple oil to commemorate it. Don't look so disappointed. Just think of how miserable you would have been to discover this canal rat had a patriotic streak. You might actually have had to uncurl that lip and treat me with something close to respect. Thank you for sparing me that discomfort, Vanek said disdainfully. He opened the door, then paused. I do wonder what a boy of your intelligence might have amounted to under different circumstances. Asked Geordie, Kaz thought with a bitter pang. But he simply shrugged. I'd just be stealing from a better class of sucker. 30 million Kruger. Vanek nodded. 30. The deal is the deal. As Vanek neatly manicured hands clasped Kaz's leather-clad fingers, the merch narrowed his eyes. Why do you wear gloves, Mr. Brecker? Kaz raised a brow. I'm sure you've heard the stories. Each more grotesque than the last. Kaz had heard them too. Brecker's hands were stained with blood. Brecker's hands were covered in scars. Brecker's hands had claws and not fingers because he was part demon. Brecker's touch burned like brimstone. A single brush of his bare skin caused your flesh to wither and die. Pick one, Kaz said as he vanished into the night. Thoughts already turning to the 30 million Kruger and the crew he'd need to help him get it. They're all true enough. That was chapter 3 of 6 of Crows. Let me know if you enjoyed it. We'll be playing, or we'll be streaming rather, this chapter again on Friday. So if you missed it today, don't worry, you can always go back and listen to it, or you can wait until Friday. See you later, guys. Stay safe. Hi everyone, hope you had a really good weekend. My name is Georgia and I am a conversation starter at the Yard, and today I'm reading for you Six of Crows. So if you've been keeping up with the story so far, we have met, I believe, all of the main characters that we focus on in this book. We've met Inej, who's like a sort of rogue, stealthy kind of person. We've got Kaz Brecker, who's like the leader of the gang. And we've got Jesper, who's like a sharpshooter. And we met just at the very beginning, who is one of the guards in the merchant's house. And if you remember, the person that he really liked, Anya, was on Jurda Prem. And so she ended up like killing everyone basically and then drowned. So that's where we're at. And now we're going to be focusing on Inej again. So this fourth chapter focuses on Inej, and it's a short chapter today, but yeah, so let's get into it. Inej knew the moment Kaz entered the slat. His presence reverberated through the cramped rooms and crooked hallways as every thug, thief, dealer, conman and steerer came a little more awake. Pascal's favoured lieutenant was home. The slat wasn't much, just another house in the worst part of the barrel, 3 stories stacked tight on top of each other, crowned with an attic and a gabled roof. Most of the buildings in this part of the city had been built without foundations, many on swampy land where the canals were haphazardly dug. They leaned against each other like tipsy friends gathered at a bar, tilting at drowsy angles. Inej had visited plenty of them on errands for the dregs, and they weren't much better on the inside. Cold, damp, plaster sliding from the walls, gaps in the windows wide enough to let in the rain and the snow. Kaz had spent his own money to have the slat's drafts shorn up and its walls insulated. It was ugly, crooked and crowded, but the slat was gloriously dry. Inej's room was on the 3rd floor, a skinny slice of space barely big enough for a cot and a trunk, with a window that looked out over the peaked roofs and jumbled chimneys of the barrel. When the wind came through and cleared away the haze of coal smoke that hung over the city, she could even make out a blue pocket of harbour. Though dawn was just a few hours away, the slat was wide awake. The only time the house was ever really quiet was in the slow hours of the afternoon, and tonight everyone was buzzing with the news of the showdown of the exchange, Big Bonja's fate, and now poor Rahaki's dismissal. Inej had gone straight from our conversation with Kaz to seek out the card dealer at the Crow Club. He'd been at the tables dealing 3-man bramble for Jesper and a couple of Valkan tourists. When he'd finished the hand, Inej had suggested they speak in one of the private gambling parlours to spare him the embarrassment of being fired in front of his friends, but Rahaki wasn't having it. "It's not fair," he bellowed when she told him Kaz's orders. "I ain't no cheat." "Take it up with Kaz," Inej replied quietly. "And keep your voice down," Jesper added, glancing at the tourists and the sailors seated at the neighbouring tables. Fights were common in the barrel, but not on the floor of the Crow Club. If you had a gripe, you'd settle it outside, where you didn't risk interrupting the hallowed practice of separating pigeons from their money. "Where's Brecker?" growled Rahaki. "I don't know." "You always know everything about everything," Rahaki sneered, leaning in, the stink of lager and onions on his breath. "Isn't that what Dirty Hands pays you for?" "I don't know where he is or when he's getting back, but I do know you won't want to be here when he does. Give me my check. I'm owed for my last shift." "Brecker doesn't owe you anything." "He can't even face me. Sends a little girl to give me the boot. Maybe I'll just shag a few coins from you." He'd reached to grab her by the collar of her shirt, but she dodged him easily. He fumbled for her again. Out of the corner of her eye, Inej saw Jesper rise from his seat, but she waved him off and slipped her fingers into the brass knuckles she kept in her right hip pocket. She gave Rahaki a swift crack across the left cheek. His hand flew up to his face. "Hey," he said, I didn't hurt you none. It was just words." People were watching now, so she hit him again. Regardless of the Crow Club rules, this took precedence. When Kaz had brought her to the slat, he warned her that he wouldn't be able to watch out for her and that she'd have to fend for herself, and she had. It would have been easy enough to turn away when they called her names or sidled up to ask for a cuddle, but you do that, and soon it was a hand up your blouse or a try at you against the wall, so she'd let no insult or innuendo slide. She'd always struck first and struck hard. Sometimes she even cut them up a bit. It was fatiguing, but nothing was sacred to the Kirch except trade, so she'd gone out of her way to make the risk much higher than the reward when it came to disrespecting her. Rahaki touched his fingers to the ugly bruise forming on his cheek, looking surprised and a bit betrayed. "I thought we was friendly," he protested. The sad part was, they were. Inej liked Rahaki, but right now he was just a frightened man looking to feel bigger than someone. "Rahaki," she'd said, "I'd seen you work a deck for cards. You could get a job in almost any den. Go home and be grateful Kaz doesn't take what you owe him off your hide. He'd gone, a bit wobbly on his feet, still clutching his cheek like a stunned toddler, and Jesper sauntered over. "He's right, you know. Kaz shouldn't send you to do his dirty work. It's all dirty work. But we do it just the same," he said with a sigh. "You look exhausted. Will you sleep at all tonight?" Jesper just winked. "Not while the cards are hot. Stay and play a bit. Kaz will stake you." "Really, Jesper?" she'd said, pulling up her hood. "If I want to watch men dig holes to fall into, I'd find myself a cemetery." "Oh, come on, Inej," he'd called after her as she passed through the big double doors onto the street. "Your good luck." Saint, she thought. If he believes that, he must really be desperate. She'd left her luck behind in the Sully camp on the shores of West Ravka. She doubted she'd see either again. Now Inej left her tiny chamber in the slat and headed downstairs by way of the banisters. There was no reason to cloak her movements here, but silence was a habit, and the stairs tended to squeak like mating mice. When she reached the second-floor landing, she saw the crowd milling below. She hung back. Kaz had been gone longer than anyone had expected, and as soon as he'd entered the shadowy foyer, he'd been waylaid by people looking to congratulate him on his routing of Gills and asking for news of the Black Tips. "Rumour has it, Gills is already putting together a mob to move in on us," said Anika. "Let him," rumbled Dirks. "I've got an axe handle with his name on it." "Gills won't out for a while," said Kaz as he moved down the hall. "He doesn't have the numbers to face us in the streets, and his coffers are too empty to hire more hands. Shouldn't you be on your way to the Crow Club?" The raised eyebrow was enough to send Anika scurrying away, Dirks on her heels. Others came to offer congratulations or make threats against the Black Tips. No one went so far as to pat Kaz on the back, though. That was a good way to lose a hand. Inej knew Kaz would stop to speak to Pascal, so instead of descending the final flight of stairs, she moved down the hallway. There was a closet here full of odds and ends, old chairs with broken backs, paint-splattered canvas sheeting. Inej moved aside a bucket full of cleaning supplies that she'd placed there precisely because she knew no one in the slat would ever touch it. The grate beneath it offered a perfect view of Pascal's office. She felt slightly guilty for eavesdropping on Kaz, but he was the one who had turned her into a spy. You couldn't train a falcon, then expect it not to hunt. Through the grate, she saw Kaz's knock on Pascal's door and the sound of his greeting. "Back and still breathing?" the old man inquired. She could just see him seated in his favourite chair, fiddling with a model ship he'd been building for the better part of a year, a pint of lager within arm's reach, as always. "We won't have a problem with Fifth Harbour again." Pascal grunted and returned to his model ship. "Close the door." Inej heard it shut, muffling the sounds from the hallway. She could see the top of Kaz's head. His hair was damp. It must have started raining. "You should have asked permission from me to deal with Bollinger," said Pascal. "If I'd talked to you first, word might have got out. You think I'd let that happen?" Kaz's shoulders lifted. "This place is like anything in Ketterdam. It leaks." Inej could have sworn he looked directly at the vent when he said it. "I don't like it, boy. Big Bollinger was my soldier, not yours." "Of course," Kaz said, but they both knew it was a lie. Pascal's dregs were old guard, common and crooks from another time. Bollinger had been one of Kaz's crew. New blood, young and unafraid, maybe a little too unafraid. You're smart, Brecker, but you need to learn patience. Yes, sir. The old man barked a laugh. Yes, sir, no, sir, he mocked. I know what you're up to when you're up to something and you start getting polite. Just what have you got brewing? A job, Kaz said. I may need to be gone for a spell. Big money? Very. Big risk? That too. But you'll get your 20%. You don't make any major moves without my say-so, understood? Kaz must have nodded, because Pascal leaned back in his chair and took a sip of lager. Are we to be very rich? Rich as saints in crowns of gold. The old man snorted. As long as I don't have to live like one. I'll talk to Pym, Kaz said. He can pick up the slack while I'm gone. Inej frowned. Just where was Kaz going? He hadn't mentioned any big job to her. And why Pym? The thought shamed her a bit. She could almost hear her father's voice. So eager to be Queen of Thieves, Inej. It was one thing to do a job and do it well. It was quite another to want to succeed at it. She didn't want a permanent place with the dregs. She wanted to pay her debts and be free of Ketterdam forever. So why should she care if Kaz chose Pym to run the gang in his absence? Because I'm smarter than Pym. Because Kaz trusts me more. But maybe he didn't trust the crew to follow a girl like her, only 2 years out of the brothels, not even 17 years old. She wore her sleeves long and the sheath of her knife mostly hid the scar on the inside of her left forearm, where the menagerie tattoo had once been, but they all knew it was there. Kaz exited Haskell's room, and Inej left her perch to wait for him as he limped his way up the stairs. Rahaki? He asked as he passed her and started up the second flight. Gone, she said, falling in behind him. He put up much of a fight? Nothing I couldn't handle. Not what I asked. He was angry. He may come back around looking for trouble. Never a shortage of that to hand, Kaz said as they reached the top floor. The attic rooms had been converted into his office and bedroom. She knew all of those flights of stairs were brutal on his bad leg, but he seemed to like having the whole floor to himself. He entered the office and without looking back at her said, Shut the door. The room was mostly taken up by a makeshift desk, an old warehouse door on top of stacked fruit crates, piled high with papers. Some of the floor bosses had started using adding machines, clanking things crowded with the stiff brass buttons and spools of paper, but Kaz did the Crow Club tallies in his head. He kept books, but only for the sake of the old man, so he had something to point to when he called something out for cheating, when he was looking for new investors. That was one of the big changes Kaz had brought to the gang. He'd given ordinary shopkeepers and legitimate businessmen the chance to buy shares in the Crow Club. At first they'd been sceptical. Sure, it was some kind of swindle, but he'd brought them in with tiny stakes and managed to gather enough capital to purchase the dilapidated old building, spruce up and get it running. It had paid back big for those early investors, or so the story went. Inej could never be sure which stories about Kaz were true and which were rumours he planted to serve his own ends. For all she knew, he'd con some poor honest trader out of his life savings to make the Crow Club thrive. I've got a job for you, Kaz said as he flipped through the previous day's figures. Each sheet would go into his memory with barely a glance. What would you say to 4 million Kruger? Money like that is more curse than a gift. My little sully idealist. All you need is a full belly and an open road, he said, the mockery clear in his voice. And an easy heart, Kaz. That was the difficult part. Now he laughed outright as he walked past the door into his tiny bedroom. No hopes of that. I'd rather have the cash. Do you want the money or not? You're not in the business of giving gifts. What's the job? An impossible job, near certain death, terrible odds, but should we scrape it? He paused, fingers on the buttons of his waistcoat. He looked distant, almost dreamy. It was rare that she heard such excitement in his raspy voice. Should we scrape it? She prompted. He grinned at her, his smile sudden and jarring as a thunderclap, his eyes near black of bitter coffee. We will be kings and queens, Inej, kings and queens. She said non-committally, pretending to examine one of her knives, determined to ignore that grin. Kaz was not a giddy boy smiling and making future plans with her. He was a dangerous player who was always working an angle, Always, she reminded herself firmly. Inej kept her eyes averted, shuffling a sack of papers into a pile on the desk as Kaz stripped out of his vest and shirt. She wasn't sure if she was flattered or insulted that he didn't seem to give a second thought to her presence. "How long will we be gone?" she asked, darting a glance at him through the open doorway. He was clawed in muscle, scars, but only 2 tattoos. The Dreg's crow and a cup on his forearm, and above it, a black R on his bicep. She'd never asked him what it meant. It was his hands that drew her attention as he shucked off his leather gloves and dipped a cloth into the wash basin. He only ever removed them in these chambers, and as far as she knew, only in front of her. Whatever affliction he might be hiding, she could see no sign of it, only slender lockpick's fingers and a tiny rope of scar tissue from some long ago street fight. "Few weeks, maybe a month," he said as he ran the wet cloth under his arms and the hard planes of his chest, water trickling down his torso. For saint's sake, Inej thought as her cheeks heated. She had lost most of her modesty during that time of the menagerie, but really there were limits. What would Kaz say if she suddenly stripped down and started washing herself in front of him? He'd probably tell him not to drip on the desk, she thought with a scowl. "A month," she said. "Are you sure you should be leaving with a black tip so rolled up?" "This is the right gamble. Speaking of which, round up Jasper and Muzzin. I want them here by dawn. And I'll need Wylan waiting at the Crow Club tomorrow night." "Wylan? If this is for a big job, just do it." Inej crossed her arms. One minute he made her blush, and the next he made her want to commit murder. "Are you going to explain any of this?" "When we all meet," he shrugged on a fresh shirt, then hesitated as he fastened the collar. "This isn't an assignment, Inej. It's a job for you to take or leave as you see fit." An alarm bell rang inside her. She endangered herself every day on the streets of the Barrel. She'd murdered for the Dreg, stolen, brought down bad men and good, and Kaz had never hinted that any of the assignments were less than a command to be obeyed. This was the price she'd agreed to when Pascal had purchased the contract and liberated her from the menagerie. So what was different about this job? Kaz finished with his buttons, pulled on a charcoal waistcoat, and tossed her something. It flashed in the air, and she caught it with one hand. When she opened her fist, she saw a massive ruby tie pin, circled by golden laurel leaves. "Fence it," Kaz said. "Whose is it?" "Ours now." "Whose was it?" Kaz stayed quiet. He picked up his coat, using a brush to clean the dried mud from it. "Someone who should have thought better before he had me jumped." "Jumped?" "You heard me. Someone got the drop on you." He looked at her and nodded once. Unease snaked through her and twisted into an anxious, rustling coil. No one got the better of Kaz. He was the toughest, scariest thing walking the alleys of the Barrel. She relied on it. So did he. "It won't happen again," he promised. Kaz pulled on a clean pair of gloves, snapped up his walking stick, and headed out the door. "I'll be back in a few hours. Move the decapel we lifted from Van Eyck's house to the vault. I think it's rolled up under my bed. Oh, and put in a new order for a new hat." "Please." Kaz heaved a sigh as he braced himself for 3 painful flights of stairs. He looked over his shoulder and said, "Please, my darling Inej, treasure of my heart, won't you do me the honour of acquiring me a new hat?" Inej cast a meaningful glance at his cane. "Have a long trip down," she said, then leaped onto the banister, sliding from one flight to the next, slick as a butter in a pan. So that was chapter 4 of 6 of Crows. Just a quick chapter today, and then next we'll be focusing on Kaz again, and we'll be seeing what his job entails and what he's going to tell his crew. So yeah, thank you for joining me. I'll see you next week, and stay safe.